Back in the fall of 2022, I was living in a cozy little house just outside of the city. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. The trees around my neighborhood were thick with autumn leaves, and the wind often carried the scent of wood smoke. The house was old but charming, with creaky floorboards and windows that rattled slightly in the wind. I shared it with my cat, Shadow, a sleek, black creature with piercing green eyes and an uncanny sense of knowing when something was wrong. Shadow wasn't your average cat. He had a way of observing me that felt almost human, like he understood everything happening around him. He wasn't particularly affectionate, but he always seemed to be watching, guarding. I'd joke with my friends that Shadow wasn't a pet, but a roommate who occasionally tolerated me. They'd laugh, but sometimes, late at night, when his eyes glowed in the dim light, I wasn't entirely sure I was joking. One night in late October, I was sitting in my living room, wrapped in a blanket with a mug of tea in hand. The wind was howling outside, making the house creak and groan as if it were alive. Shadow was perched on the windowsill, staring intently into the darkness. I glanced over at him and chuckled. "What are you looking at, bud?" I asked, but he didn't so much as twitch an ear. His eyes were locked on something beyond the glass, unblinking. It gave me a strange feeling, like an itch at the back of my mind. I got up and peered outside, but all I saw was the shadowy outline of trees swaying in the wind. Satisfied it was nothing, I went back to the couch, but Shadow didn't move. He stayed there for hours, staring. It wasn't until I finally went to bed that he leapt down and followed me upstairs, curling up on the foot of my bed as usual. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of a loud thud. My heart jumped into my throat as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The house was silent except for the wind, but something felt off. Shadow was no longer on the bed. I glanced around and saw him standing at the doorway, his back arched and his fur puffed out, staring into the dark hallway. "Shadow," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond, didn't even look at me. His gaze was fixed on something I couldn't see, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. Shadow never growled. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Shadow darted ahead of me, moving with a determination I'd never seen before. He stopped at the top of the stairs, his body rigid, and stared down into the pitch-black living room below. I hesitated, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps. Not the creak of the house settling, but deliberate, careful steps on the wooden floor. I froze. My mind raced. Who could be in my house? How had they gotten in? My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever was downstairs could hear it. Shadow let out a sharp hiss, his tail lashing furiously. I should have called the police. That would have been the smart thing to do. But adrenaline and fear clouded my judgment. Instead, I crept down the stairs, clutching my phone like a weapon. Shadow stayed ahead of me, his movements almost predatory as he led the way. The living room was dimly lit by the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. First, I saw nothing unusual. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. There, in the corner near the back door, was a figure. A man, dressed in dark clothing, crouched low as if trying to make himself invisible. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a surge of cold terror wash over me. Shadow hissed again, louder this time, and the man's head snapped up. His eyes met mine, and for a moment we were both frozen. Then he moved. He lunged toward the back door, fumbling with the lock in a desperate attempt to escape. My paralysis broke, and I shouted, "Get out! I'm calling the police!" My voice sounded stronger than I felt. Shadow bolted forward, his claws skidding on the floor as he swiped at the man's legs. The intruder yelped and stumbled, finally managing to throw the door open and vanish into the night. I stood there, shaking, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. Shadow returned to my side, his fur still bristling but his eyes calm and steady as he looked up at me. It was as if he was saying, "I told you so." The police arrived about 10 minutes later. I gave them a description of the man and showed them the scratches Shadow had left on the floor near the door. They found signs of forced entry on one of the downstairs windows, but no sign of the intruder. They told me I was lucky, that he probably wasn't expecting anyone to be home. Lucky? Maybe. But I knew better. If it hadn't been for Shadow, I might not have woken up in time. He had sensed the danger long before I did. His instincts sharper and more attuned than mine could ever be. That night, as I lay in bed with Shadow curled up beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd saved my life. He wasn't just a cat. He was my protector, my guardian in the dark. And as much as I'd always joked about him being otherworldly, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was some truth to it. Since then, I've been more careful about locking my doors and windows. But no matter how secure my house is, I sleep better knowing Shadow is there, his green eyes watching over me, ready to warn me of any danger lurking in the night. I never thought much about Sycamore Street. It was just a shortcut home, lined with crooked trees and uneven sidewalks, a place where the streetlights flickered too often. But that night, it became something else entirely. It became the place where everything started. It was late, past midnight, and my best friend Eric and I were walking home from a movie. The night had a kind of thick stillness, like the world was holding its breath. The air smelled faintly of rain, though the sky was dry, and the only sounds were our footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. We were halfway down the street when we saw it. At first, I thought it was just a pile of trash left by the curb, a dark, crumpled shape barely visible in the dim glow of the streetlight. But as we got closer, the details came into focus. Fur matted and clumped, a body too still, too stiff. It was a cat, or it had been a cat. Eric stopped short, his hand instinctively reaching out to grab my arm. "That's weird," he muttered. I nodded, swallowing hard. Something about the scene felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't just the cat. It was the way it was lying there, perfectly positioned in the middle of the sidewalk, as if placed there deliberately. Eric crouched down, squinting at the animal. "There's no blood," he said, his voice low. "If it got hit by a car, wouldn't there be blood?" He was right. The cat looked untouched, almost like it was asleep, except for the unnatural stillness of its body and the way its eyes stared blankly into the dark. I shivered, suddenly aware of how cold the night had become. "We should go," I said, my voice shaking. "There's nothing we can do." Eric hesitated but stood up, brushing his hands on his jeans. Yeah. We kept walking, but the atmosphere had changed. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive. Every creak of a branch or distant rustle made my heart jump. I glanced back once, half expecting to see the cat sitting up, watching us, but it was still there, just a dark smudge against the pavement. We didn't talk much as we walked. The weight of what we'd seen clung to us like a shadow. When we finally reached Eric's house, he hesitated on the porch. "You good to get home?" he asked, his voice unusually serious. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. My house was only a few blocks away, but the idea of walking back down Sycamore Street made my stomach twist. Still, I didn't want to admit I was scared, so I gave him a quick wave and kept going. The street felt different on the way back. The shadows seemed darker, the air heavier. I kept my eyes straight ahead, trying not to think about the cat. But when I passed the spot where we'd seen it, I couldn't help myself. I looked. It was gone. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sidewalk was empty. No fur, no body, not even a trace. I glanced around, my eyes darting to the street, the bushes, the gutter, but there was nothing. Just an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I walked faster after that, practically running the last block to my house. When I got inside, I locked the door behind me and turned on every light in the living room. I sat there for hours, staring at the window, half expecting to see those lifeless eyes staring back at me. But the night passed without incident, and eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe someone had moved the cat. Maybe it hadn't been dead after all. The next day, I called Eric to tell him about it, but he didn't answer. I figured he was busy and decided to let it go. But when I saw him at school the following Monday, he looked terrible, pale, with dark circles under his eyes. He pulled me aside during lunch, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did anything happen to you after you left?" he asked. I hesitated. "What do you mean?" He glanced around, as if afraid someone might overhear. "I heard something that night, scratching at my window. I thought it was just a branch or something, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Just nothing." A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to tell him about the cat, about how it was gone when I walked back, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just nodded, my stomach churning with unease. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. Eric started seeing shadows out of the corner of his eye, small, darting shapes that disappeared when he turned to look. I started hearing things in my house at night, soft thumps, like footsteps, and the faint sound of something dragging across the floor. Once, I woke up to find my bedroom window open, even though I was sure I'd locked it before bed. The final straw came one night in late October. Eric and I were walking home again, this time cutting through the park to avoid Sycamore Street. We were halfway through when we heard it, a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. We froze, our eyes scanning the darkness. The sound came again, closer this time, and that's when we saw it. A pair of glowing eyes staring at us from the shadows. They were too low to the ground to belong to a person, and the shape behind them was unmistakable. It was the cat, or something that looked like it. It moved slowly toward us, its body unnaturally stiff, its head tilted at an angle that made my stomach turn. Eric grabbed my arm, pulling me backward, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The cat, or whatever it was, stopped a few feet away, its eyes locked on mine, and then it let out a sound I'll never forget. A shrill, bone-chilling screech that echoed through the empty park. We ran. I don't think we stopped until we were back at Eric's house, slamming the door shut behind us. We didn't talk about it after that, not really. Eric stopped walking home with me, and I started taking the long way around, avoiding Sycamore Street and the park altogether. It started like any ordinary evening. The air was crisp, the kind of cool that nips at your cheeks but feels good after a long day. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the streetlights hummed to life, casting a soft yellow glow over Grimsby Street. I was on my way home, cutting through the quieter side of town. The street was empty, the kind of silence that feels almost too still, as if the world is holding its breath. That's when I saw it. A black cat appeared out of nowhere, slipping soundlessly from the shadows. Its fur was so dark it seemed to absorb the light, and its yellow eyes glowed like twin embers. It stopped dead in the middle of the sidewalk, staring straight at me. For a moment, I thought about the old superstition. Black cats bringing bad luck, but I brushed it off. Superstitions are just stories, right? I stepped forward, and the cat bolted, vanishing into an alleyway. But as soon as it disappeared, the air around me seemed to change. It felt heavier, like walking through a thick fog, though the street was clear. The silence grew oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of a car engine somewhere far off. I told myself I was imagining things and kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. As I neared the corner, I heard a sound, soft at first, like a faint whisper carried on the breeze. It grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps, not the rhythmic click of heels or the scuffle of sneakers, but uneven, dragging footsteps. They seemed to echo in time with my own, but when I stopped, they didn't. I spun around. The street was empty. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling just enough to betray the confidence I was trying to project. No answer, just the hum of the streetlights and the faint rustle of leaves. I quickened my pace, heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps resumed, closer this time. I didn't dare look back again. It was just my imagination, I told myself, just the echo of my own steps. But I could feel the weight of a gaze on my back, pressing down like an unseen hand. Then I saw the cat again. It was perched on a low wall, its unblinking eyes fixed on me. It didn't move, didn't flinch even as I walked past. But as I rounded the corner, a sharp, guttural hiss cut through the air. I turned back to find the wall empty. The cat was gone. That's when the streetlights started flickering. One by one, they buzzed and blinked out, plunging the street into darkness. My breath hitched, and I fumbled for my phone, desperate for a light. The flashlight beam wavered as my hands shook, casting long, jittery shadows against the brick walls. And then I saw it. In the beam of my flashlight, a figure stood at the far end of the street. At first, it looked like a person, but something about it was wrong. It was too tall, its limbs too long, and its movements were jerky, unnatural. The shadows around it seemed to pulse, shifting like smoke. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it started moving forward. Not walking, but gliding, its feet never touching the ground. The air grew colder with each step it took. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I could hear a faint, distorted whisper, like a broken radio tuning in and out. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, accusing. Finally, my legs obeyed and I bolted. I didn't care where I was going, as long as it was away from that thing. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and I could feel it gaining on me, the cold wrapping around me like icy fingers. I turned a corner and nearly collapsed with relief when I saw the warm glow of a diner up ahead. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, the bell above jingling loudly. The few patrons inside turned to stare, their faces a mix of surprise and concern. "You okay?" the waitress asked, her voice cutting through the haze of panic. I nodded, unable to speak, and sank into a booth near the window. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, the street was empty again. No figure, no cat, just the faint buzz of the streetlights, now steady and unblinking. I stayed in that diner for hours, too afraid to leave. When I finally did, it was in the safety of the morning light. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes, I catch a glimpse of a black cat out of the corner of my eye, or hear those dragging footsteps in the quiet of the night. And every time, I wonder, is it watching me, waiting, or did I just imagine it all?